Welcome to Adventures in Solitaire. Today we'll be covering an overview and review of Ironsworn Starforged. So as stated in the intro, today we'll be covering a review and overview of Ironsworn Starforged. So as always, what is Ironsworn Starforged? Ironsworn Starforged builds itself as a tabletop role-playing game of science fiction exploration and adventure. But I think its main draw is its strong focus on solo and co-op role-playing. Or at least that is its draw for me as a solo role-player. Starforged is built upon the Ironsworn tabletop role-playing system. There have been quite a few changes, mainly to theme, but also in the amount of content that it provides, in addition to some gameplay changes. Combat more immediately comes to mind here. Ironsworn and Starforged make good use of the foundations set by Apocalypse World and Dungeon World, as well as others. Starforged has a good amount of content and ideas to talk about, and I'll do my best to cover as many aspects of it as I can in a single review, given the breadth of the content that I'll be covering. I will be providing an index shortly after upload so you can kind of move between those topics that interest you, because you may not be interested in all of those. So with that out of the way, I think it's time that we talk about Starforged and its systems. In most solo game systems, you have a question. You ask it and you get an answer. The only real guardrail is a tacked-on role-playing system and how you are handling those conjectures. It is exceptionally open, and this can be a great thing, mind you. But the move system that is implemented by both Ironsworn and Starforged asks that you attempt something and gives you guidance, rewards, and penalties for those attempts. It keeps you grounded and guided with your conjecture. Every choice feels like it has some weight. When I am playing any game, I want my choices to have weight, with both reward and consequence. The difficulty of Starforged is mentioned in many communities, but I think that it is that difficulty, player-induced or otherwise, that gives the system its weight in the choices that we make. Every choice is a chance for opportunity, a chance for adventure, and a chance for change of pace and or direction. While this may not appeal to everyone, it hit home with me. There are moves for almost anything that you can do within a game. This even includes the starting and ending of one of your game sessions, but most of the moves will have something to do with actions that you're taking within your RPG narrative. That could be traveling somewhere or engaging in conversation or combat. And moves in general will look something like this. You will have a description of when you can or should make use of the move. In this case, it is when you try to persuade someone or make them an offer. Envision your approach. It will then give you some options to choose from. So you will have to ask yourself which one of these is the most fitting for your current situation. Some of them may not be applicable. There have been cases in my playthrough where I wanted to use a certain attribute I was good at for a move, but I could not, as it did not make sense for the situation, and I would only have been using that option for the attribute, as an example. After you choose your approach, you will then make a roll. So this is where we get to talk about another mechanic, as moves are exceptionally dependent on this part of the Ironsworn system, and that is the action roll. You can think of the action roll like making a difficulty check, except the difficulty check number that you're rolling against is not static, but it is random. Your difficulty check is determined by rolling 2 10-sided dice. You will then have 2 separate numbers. Your goal is to at least beat one of those numbers when you roll your die, but you really want to beat both of them. And note that I said beat. This is not a meet or exceed roll. You must roll higher. To make matters a little more tense here, the die, that is, the die that you'll be rolling to beat this difficulty check, is a D6. Right, a D6. So you can see why rolling 2 D10s would be a good thing, or you would be failing well over half of your rolls. The good news is that if we look back on our move, it gave us different approaches that we could use. The approach you'll choose will decide on the attribute that you'll be using for the roll. You would then add your attribute value, your whole value, to your D6 roll. So this can, and I say can, definitely help this situation, but given that your attributes at default will look something like this, and by the way, these are default values. This can be adjusted, but in general, you will get one attribute with a value of 3, two attributes with a value of 2, and two other attributes with a value of 1. And a value of 1 is not going to help you much here. In addition, these attribute values, they won't go up. What you have when you create your character is what you'll likely have when your character retires or moves on to the great beyond. So going back to the example move, if we were to successfully beat one of the rolled D10 values, then we would have something called a weak hit. If we were to beat both of the D10 values, then we would have what's called a strong hit. Weak hits almost always come with some form of consequence, but you'll still manage to accomplish your move most of the time. While strong hits will have you accomplishing your move with some added benefits. You will note that there is no such thing as a simple you just hit. You either do really well or you don't. That of course leaves us with a miss, where you don't beat either of the D10 values. This can have entire ranges of consequences, and you really want to do your best to avoid them, though you'll likely be rolling these more than you would want. You can also do something called resetting your momentum to affect the outcome of the rolls. This is a pretty neat feature. As you play the game, you'll gain momentum, which is tracked on the left-hand side of your character sheet. It has a default base reset value of +2. But as you play and succeed in your moves, you will start gaining momentum. Sometimes even losing it, but most of the time it'll be a gain. The moves will tell you specifically when to do this and by how much. But once your momentum reaches a certain point, and that's up to you, you can reset it back down to its base value, again, would be +2. Before you do though, you will take the number that it was originally at, and you'll use it in place of your die roll. Now, this is after you have rolled the die, by the way, not before. You'll also get to add your attribute to your roll along with any other modifiers that you may have. So this is a great way to get past some really tough situations or really nail it home when you really want a certain outcome. I really do love this. It really gave that extra effort mechanic for your character. And once you use the momentum, as stated, you'll need to reset the momentum back to +2. Now, there are some things that will change the base value, and there are some things that will give you negative momentum below 0. But in my experience, this is pretty rare unless things are already going really, really bad. And by really bad, I mean that your character may well be on their way out anyway. So back to moves. The number of moves in Starforged is pretty large. I went to go and print out some cheat sheets and ended up stopping, and I ended up having getting mine printed out locally. But before that, it took quite a bit to get those organized. When I think of these moves, I think of them as actions and like a dungeon crawl board game. Most dungeon crawls have a series of actions that you can take each turn. We usually have to spend time memorizing these moves so we know what we can do with our miniatures or miniature. So 50 moves sounds about insane, again, which is what this has, over 50. But you'll really only need to refer to these when you want to do something. So if you want to fly through space, then you'll find the move that describes that move. If you don't want to fly through space, then it's just not needed. You don't need to be bothered with looking up what move might pertain to that. Although this can seem overwhelming, I was actually very pleased with all of the moves. When I had played Dungeon World, I honestly felt like there were not nearly enough moves. I remember complaining about this to my wife specifically. I wanted more, and well, now I have more. So we've talked about moves, we've talked about action rolls. We saw that the difficulty can seem a bit sharp, so thankfully there's some additional things beyond attribute values and momentum that can help you with this. Both Ironsworn and Starforged have a very large library of something called assets. The number of assets available actually surpasses the number of moves available by a good amount. I believe there's a total of around 87 assets for Starforged. And assets are just what they say they are. They are assets. They can be character paths, which you can loosely think of as, say, skills. They can be companions like animals or robots or even NPC friends. They can be vehicles or starship upgrades. And they can also be earnable deeds that your character can learn or be gifted with throughout gameplay. You will start the game with 4 assets. One of them being your starship. These assets can give you bonuses, change how hits and miss works for moves. They can allow you to change how the dice are rolled. My sleuth ability allows me to roll 3 challenge dice instead of just 2, and it let me drop the lowest die. That's a huge benefit, at least when I can make use of the ability. So you'll definitely want to be selective with the assets that you choose, because a lot of these abilities are very situation specific. Some abilities will have those situations happening more, and some less. You'll likely want to focus on attributes that you'll be using for yourself more often than not. I do not do this, and instead I chose to focus on assets that were thematic and fit my character's role in the game setting. Now, this is equally as viable and can really help draw you in and put you in tight situations. It is also the way I prefer to play, but you could simply choose those assets that you think would be used most often to get the maximal effect out of your roles. As you play the game, your character will gain experience and will eventually be able to either upgrade or acquire new assets. So while your attributes do remain static, if you enjoy the leveling process in role-playing sessions, as I do, then you'll definitely have this here in the way of assets, and it's another part of the game system that I really enjoy. Okay, so now we know how to do things, or take actions, and how assets and attributes can help us succeed more often with those actions, but we don't really know why we're taking actions, or what establishes direction in our game. So this is where we get to our next topic, vows. So though the move system is so very integral, it is the vow mechanic that gives us guidance for our adventures into the unknown. In Starforged, vows are similar to a solid promise, but these promises should be considered to have weight. They should feel like breaking them would break who you are and what you stand for. Failure would then, of course, come with some very heavy emotional weight to your character. You and your character will make these promises from time to time. So what does that look like? So let's say that you enter a local settlement and find out that it was recently ravaged by a local alien menace. Or perhaps it was just a group of, well, not just, but a group of marauding bandits. And you decide that you won't stand for it. Your character cannot just walk away from what they have seen before them. So you make your way to the local settlement center and let the whole settlement know that you vow to take care of this menace, and that you will not stop until every last one of these marauders or creatures are driven away for good. At this point, you will have a vow, and there will be rewards for completing it and penalties for failing to uphold your vow or your promise. This may not seem like a big deal, but because these vows have weighted rewards and consequences, you'll more often than not be doing everything you can to see these vows completed. And it is up to you, after all, to decide which ones you take or don't take. So generally speaking, those vows will be things you want to do and that you'll want to see completed, consequence or not. As mentioned before, there are moves for almost anything that you could want to do. And so too, is there a move for establishing a vow. You'll always be successful with the vow, and the only major consequence for the miss is that you'll have to work a little harder to get your vow underway. When I first saw that, I almost wanted to miss just for the opportunity to have some more background or story to my vow. So even a miss here would give you something. There are ways to fail the vow and to back out of the vows as well. But backing out of these vows has some pretty weighty consequences. And they should, because the vow has weight, as it should. So it is best to make sure that you are ready to commit in the short term or the long term to this vow. In addition to making standard vows, your character will also have a background vow. This background vow is no small thing. In the book, it states that it is something that could be considered a lifelong vow. It is something that may take a campaign or even multiple campaigns to see it completed. So you can think of this vow as something incredibly personal for your character. It would be like asking you what you want to do with your life. What is the most important thing for you to accomplish? So no small thing, to be sure. So once you have this vow, or any vow, how do you track them? What does that look like? For that, we'll need to talk about the progress system for vows and or quests. Starforged gives various things to track progress on. In specific, you'll be tracking these 4 common tasks. Quests, also called vows, expeditions, connections, and combat. Though your background vow will be tracked on your character sheet, all other vows, etc. will be tracked on a separate sheet. On this sheet, you will notice that there are small sections here that have what look to be progress bars of some kind. And that is exactly what they are. So when you swear a vow, start an expedition, or make connections, or enter into combat, you'll write down the specifics or the goal on the top portion. And as you have success and progress through these goals, you will fill in these tracks. But you may also notice that there are a set of 5 different difficulties as well. The difficulties are a measure of how long or how much you're going to have to do before the goal can be completed. Having said that, the game will let you attempt to complete the goal before you have completely cleared the progress track. To do this, you'll simply take the number of squares of progress that you have filled and use that in place of your die roll. You'll then roll the challenge dice and see if your total exceeds the number shown on your challenge dice, just as it would for any other challenge. So it is important that we touched on the aforementioned difficulty rating. Each difficulty will have you fill in boxes at different rates. Troublesome will have you fill in 3 boxes every time you successfully progress towards your goal. Dangerous will have you fill in 2, and formidable 1. After these difficulty rates, you'll start making individual strikes, or ticks if you will, instead of the full star pattern seen here. In extreme, you'll make 2 strikes, ticks, and then in epic, you'll be making only 1 at a time. So each box will take a total of 4 ticks to fill. That is a total of 40. Yes, 40 ticks for epic, or to fill in individually for the entire bar. So that's 40 successful progressions, to be clear. So to put that a bit further into perspective, making progress on these tracks takes a certain type of move. Specifically, it takes a progressive move. So I'm going to show a few here, but there are only a few of these compared to the vast number of moves. But to be honest, as long as you're doing reasonable at your moves, you will be making these a lot quicker than the number of moves for these may suggest at first glance. When you successfully strike an enemy, for example, you can mark progress on your combat track. And let's not forget that our character assets can help with this as well. With the vows or quest system that Starforged uses, you should always have something to do, and more than likely, as your adventure continues and your world becomes more and more fleshed out around your characters, you will have many things to tackle and resolve. So far, we have covered vows, moves, the action dice, progression, and assets, which is a lot of territory here. We have not, however, discussed character advancement and experience. With that, let's talk about the experience. If you look at your character sheet, you will see 3 areas. We briefly mentioned these earlier. Those areas are quests, bonds, and discoveries. And each of these areas is linked to a set of moves, which are quest moves, connection moves, and exploration moves. Each of these move sets correlates to their respective area on the character sheet. Quest moves for quests, connection moves for bonds, and exploration moves for discoveries. Each of the areas has a move that, if completed, will net you a certain number of ticks in a box on a respective progress bar. When you fill a box in a bar, you're able to cross off one or more of the smaller boxes below to gain an experience for each of these smaller boxes that you crossed off. It takes 2 experience to upgrade an existing asset, and it takes 3 experience to purchase a new asset. Now, this next statement will vary with your playstyle and how much time you have to dedicate to playing the game, but I typically spend about 30 minutes to an hour in my sessions, so we can safely say I spend about 45 minutes on average. It takes me about 2 to 3 sessions to get a box fully checked, typically 3, and maybe around 5, maybe 6 sessions to get the second box. It depends on a few factors aside from time, such as how many overlapping quest lines or progress tracks you have running, but it doesn't take too long, and I think the pace is about right here. Even though there are many assets to gain, there are quite a few that your character wouldn't normally use without breaking the theme of your story, or breaking who your character is. So that means that despite the vast number of assets that there are only a fraction that you'll likely want to use. And if you were leveling every single session, then you would quickly exhaust your reasonable growth options for your character here. Starforged does offer a rather unique mechanic in the way of legacy moves. When your character dies or retires, you can make a legacy move with a brand new character. So it's a new character that'll be making that move. You will look at the quests, bonds, discoveries, and experience tracks and see what their values are. You'll then roll challenge dice against each of them individually. For each one, you'll check for strong and weak hits in addition to misses. Each of these will impact the world that your new character is about to enter into, or potentially for your new character themselves. Also, it is possible that you might fill in the quest, bonds, discovery tracks of your character, as in filling them all up. If you find yourself in this situation, then the tracks reset. You'll notice that each track has a 10 in the top right. When you clear the track, you'll fill this in. And from now on, when you would fill in a box for only the clear track, you'll get 1 experience pip that you can take per box instead of the standard 2. But obviously this would take quite some time to do because it would take quite some time to fill up one of these bars, just one anyway. While we have touched on how to use your character, we have not addressed how to, well, create your character in any real detail. The game will walk you through this process pretty quickly. I think the longest parts of character creation for me were actually just picking my assets here. As there were so many cool options available, as well as getting my backstory set to my comfort level. All in all, if you're familiar with this system, you can have a character up and running within maybe less than 5 to 10 minutes if you're in a bit of a rush. I spent some time walking my wife through the Ironsworn system, and I think it took us about an hour for both of our characters, and that was mostly me explaining the system to her and allowing her to take her time as she poured through the trove of assets. That's not bad when I think of other RPG systems that are out there. In addition, you'll assign scores of 3, a 2, a 2, a 1, and a 1 to each of your attributes. You'll pick 2 path assets and a final asset of any type for your character. From there, you'll write down your equipment, which is really just a quick standard list, and you can make up your own. After that, you'll mark your 3 values on the right. You'll max those out, followed by your momentum on the left. You will then write down your background vow. Likely after you have done your backstory. I actually highly recommend you do this process first, as it can determine how and why you choose everything else for your character. After this, you'll have a completed character ready to play. The only thing lacking for game setup at this point would be the world in which they live in. So let's talk a moment about that. Starforged does not come with a campaign setting, at least not in the way that we would typically think of one. Rather, it provides us with a sandbox and all of the tools to fill it, but it does so in a very accessible way. And I'll briefly show some of these sections here so you can see the breadth of the scope. I was very pleased. Many solo systems or books will give you oracles and just say, here, have at it. But this really walks you through every single step in the process, holding your hand as much as you want, or letting it go so you can just put your creativity to work. Any setting you can think of, or at least that I could think of readily, is an option here. So while we're talking about the universe setup, let's talk about maps and travel for a moment. Starforged does not come with any maps, but it does come with a single blank map sheet. This is this sector map sheet. Now, the interesting thing about this sheet, at least for me, are the hexes on the map area. They could be used to denotate distance and location, but they're really just there for ease of reference and for your eyes. The book even states that the grid is not there to show any specific distances. Now, I do use this as a reference for general distance ideas or themes, but otherwise it's there more of a kind of like a scratch pad for the local sector that you are currently within. But other than this, there are no maps. The game does explain how to label star systems and safe passages for travel, but it leaves the rest up to you. It also provides an area for notes below. So what about planetary travel, dungeons or structures, maybe even spacecraft? There are no maps for these, and there are no instructions on how to map these types of areas. These types of areas of travel, or rather movement, are meant for the most part to be abstracted and part of the narrative. Starforged does have a great deal of oracles dealing with various types of structures, including rooms, passages, various features in rooms. This also includes events, etc. We'll touch more on these oracles soon, but there are no mapping systems, at least as far as hand-drawn mapping systems. I have found that as a DM, when I was DMing in my youth, I would often give verbal descriptions of rooms and corridors and do rough, quick sketches for the groups I DM'd for. So I was already right at home with this type of system. I would say that if you're looking for miniatures and terrain, while it's technically possible to do with stock Starforged, the system is not built for this. You will need to exercise some creative thinking or be ready to blend the Ironsworn system with one or more others to get this to work in any real detail. But again, I do not mind the system as it is, and I would have likely adopted this playstyle even if it did have an exact turn-by-turn, meter-by-meter combat rules as I have in my other systems. So I was right at home here. While on the topic of mapping, I think it's also worth mentioning that the blank sector map could also be easily doubled as a dirt side planetary map with settlements and rough distances there as well, using the detailed info below for the various features and settlements that you run into, which is what I plan to do. Okay, so this time we've covered a lot. So aside from comments on presentation of material and final thoughts, the last bit to cover is on the available oracles, or in other words, random tables and idea or conjectural generators. This is easily one of my favorite parts of the book. It has one of the most comprehensive sets of oracles that I have or have seen, especially in the realm of science fiction. I recently did a poll of the best books for random tables and oracles, and Starforged and Ironsworn definitely came up. This is a pretty big statement for a role-playing system core book, so let's take a look at some of those available oracles. We have core oracles, we have space encounters, planets, settlements, starships, characters, creatures, factions, derelicts, precursor vaults, location themes, and miscellaneous oracles. For some role-playing systems, the list of categories would be their equivalent or less of the number of random tables to roll off of. So hopefully this should already have you excited. I still smile at the number of tables offered here. Starforged offers your typical oracle tables like your action, your theme, descriptor, and focus. It has various name generators for ships, sectors, stellar objects, you name it. It has various environmental peril tables. It has tables for the various different environments that are specific to those environments. The list could go on and on. I could easily spend at least a half hour just quickly covering all the tables in the book. So rather than go through all of that, I think it's probably a good time to talk about final thoughts. Before I'd heard of Ironsworn, I had played through a couple of solo and co-op sessions of Dungeon World. I pored over its pages and looked online for extra resources, purchasable or otherwise. It really didn't seem to have that much at the time. I had a difficult time wrapping my head around some of its systems, as I had not played Apocalypse World, which it was based upon, or anything else that used similar game mechanics. I could see how its unique system could help for solo role-playing, but the system just felt thin. I looked for tables and charts for weapons and equipment, monsters and the like, and though the book had them, it was severely lacking when compared to some of the heavy hitters in the pen and paper role-playing market. In the end, I set the book down and really only touched it to move it from shelf to one shelf or another, which was a shame to be for sure. When Ironsworn came out, I saw another system that was heavy on gameplay structure and light on the details in regards to characters, equipment, and enemies, at least upon initial inspection at the time. Little did I know how wrong I was. See, I'd only glanced through the system, seeing what I thought was a familiar outlook on tabletop role-playing and solo options. Some years would pass, and I heard about Starforged. By this time, Ironsworn had caught on and had quite the following. It went from PDF to print, and I saw it almost everywhere solo gamers were talking about solo role-playing. Starforged was starting to get my interest, but I just couldn't bring myself to make the move. I had remembered my mere glance through the Ironsworn manual, and a few months ago, I started to get comments on my channel about Starforged. Now, again, I was interested, but there was still hesitation. Then I heard more on the channel and even heard even more recommendations on our Facebook group. And when we had one of our members graciously offer to purchase a copy for playthrough and review, that did it. I had to step in and see what it was about. I was a fan of science fiction after all. That was it. I was going to do it. So I personally pre-ordered the hardback copy myself and poured over the PDF version I had. It didn't take long before I was killing the love of my print and play do-it-yourself life, my printer. I had sacrificed my printer to Starforged, and I'm still without a printer. There are a few things that really caught my attention about Starforged, but the move system in particular and the way that it addressed it and explained it made its uses clear. For me, it gave me weight and consequence to the conjecture role-playing experience that so many solo role players are all too familiar with. Its move library is exceptionally large. I simply could not find many, if any, situations where there was not a move for something I wanted to do. While some may balk at the move set, I revel in its options. I am not left wanting as I was with Dungeon World. In Dungeon World, I remember reading that I could make my own moves for things that were not made available in the manual. I simply do not see the need to do so with Starforged, and that is such a relief given my desire for direction and structure. While we all, as solo role players, create quest lines, Starforged pushes the player to do so. The way it handles the advancement of those quest lines, along with the way that it lends consequence to those quests, while at the same time pairing it with the experience system, just goes further to add to the choice and consequences that the move system handles so well. When I think about what I value in a game, and that could be PC games, console games, board games, and our current topic, pen and paper role-playing, I tend to value a few things above all others. And that is the sense that my actions have impact, for better or for worse, that anything I do can affect the world around me. I also desire a sense of discovery, awe, and wonder at the things that I find and am yet to find. I want a sense of advancement and meaning. Starforged handles all of these needs in such an accessible way that I have yet encountered. It is one of the best systems I have found for introducing new players to the solo role-playing experience. It can lead the new solo role player to new avenues of more complicated solo role-playing concepts, but I feel that it also provides a great solo experience for veterans of solo role-playing as well. I think that if this was all that Starforged had accomplished for me, it would be a worthwhile purchase. But it did more than that. The easy barrier to entry on how it handles social mechanics and relationship development was a definite surprise for me. I felt as though it took the weight of handling social relationship development that I'm used to with some of my other systems and made it a clear and evolutionary process that only helped with that sense of discovery. Finding social connection in solo role-playing can sometimes feel a bit bland, and there are not many systems that I've seen that handle this in such a succinct and easy-to-follow manner. I felt that not only was I discovering sights and great wonders in the world and the universe, but I was also discovering characters that were meaningful to me, and that for me can be a rarity with solo role-playing, and it was an element that, as I said, both surprised and excited me. On the topic of surprises, while I really enjoyed the way that Starforged handled the leveling and experience process in meaningful, tangible ways, I think the other thing that really caught me was the vast amount of oracles. This is one of those situations that as a solo role player, I would want both the physical copy and the digital copy of the manual. The oracles are easily system neutral so that I could use them in other systems in my own private oracle booklet. Honestly, if you're only looking for oracles, the reference guide right here by itself, and this is my own personal printed copy, by the way, but that reference guide by itself would be worth the purchase for that alone. It is one of the most inclusive, wide-reaching databases of oracles that I own for a sci-fi theme. I just don't have any other that I can think of off the top of my head that, well, maybe one other, that goes so far. So I was definitely surprised, and it continues to pay off every time I open that section of the system. Now, I know that there are those that will see some parts of the game systems that Starforged has to offer and say that it's not for them. And there's really not much more fair than that. But while I do value the concept of wealth, equipment, character options, kits, and or gear, Starforged still provides such an accessible experience that I find myself not missing those options near as much as I thought I would. But I would still like to see some of those things added and focused on, but the whole of the experience is better than some of those weaker parts, at least for me. I feel as if I could not be more pleased at my pre-order of the system, and I anxiously await my hardback copy of the game. As stated, I ruined my printer to get this game up and running for playthrough and review. I printed the cards, the sheets, and even had the reference guide custom printed, as I knew I would be using that in the future extensively. And the last thing that I did, and likely the most important thing that I did in my home library, was create a custom binder. There are only 4 game systems that I have done this with, and Starforged is one of them. So it is as with many of the products that I choose to invest in, though not all, it will have, because I haven't received it yet, a special place by my desk where it belongs. So, with that, as always, if you have watched all the way through or not, thank you so very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.